Okay, so good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. We are very pleased to see such a large audience today. Thank you for joining, and thank you also those who are joining us online. My name is Fanny Badache, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Global Governance Center here at the Graduate Institute. So just before we start, I'll just do some brief introductions and also perhaps give a quick overview of the event and also of the book that we're going to be launching today, which is entitled International Organizations and Research Methods, an Introduction. The book, I think it's somewhere over there, maybe we can just circle it.
We also have flyers.
Okay, good. So it appeared this year with Michigan University Press, and I think it's really a must read for every student, social science student, but also more generally for anyone interested in the study of IOs more broadly. So this event is co-hosted by the Global Governance Center, the University of Lausanne, and the University of Geneva, with in partnership with the Groupe de Recherche sur l'Action Multilatérale and the Observatoire du Multilatéralisme et des Organisations Internationales. So we have a very tight agenda today, and that's to discuss. So I'm just going to introduce the speakers. So we have today with us Fanny Badache. So Carrie is a lecturer at the Institute for Environmental Sciences at the University of Geneva. Next to Carrie, we have Valérie Gorin, who is the head of learning at the Geneva Center of Humanitarian Studies, and she's also a senior lecturer at the University of Lausanne and Unité de France. Next, we have Fanny Badache, who is co-editor of the book. Fanny is a postdoctoral researcher at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Also, we have with us Lucile Maertens, also one of the co-editors of the book. And Lucile recently joined the Institute as an associate professor in international relations and political science. We have with us also Leah Kimber. Leah is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Geneva and also a co-editor of the volume. We would like to also welcome Annabelle Litos-Bonnet. So Annabelle is a professor of international relations and political science, also here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Next, we have Sandra Lavenex. So Sandra is a professor of European and international politics at the University of Geneva. And last but not least, we are very pleased to have with us today Francesco Pisano, who is the director of Library and Archives at the United Nations Office here in Geneva. So we will start with some preliminary remarks by the editors first. So they will be presenting the book. Then we'll have about half an hour where I'm going to ask some questions to the speakers. And then finally, we will open up the floor to the audience for questions. So Fanny, Leah, and Lucile, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anita. Okay. Welcome. Is the mic? Should we use the mic?
It doesn't matter. You can, whichever.
Okay. So welcome. Welcome everyone. I think on behalf of Lucile and Leah and myself, we are very happy to welcome you here to launch this edited volume. Thank you very much for being here with us in Geneva, and also the many of you who are online. Thank you so much. The idea of this quick talk today is to present you the origins, the inception of the book, of course, to give you some insights of the publication process, and also to give you a bit of on the content of the book. I will start with the origins of the book. Yeah. So the origin of the book, of this edited volume, are really rooted in our own personal experiences of researching international organizations. The three of us are working on the IOs and the United Nations specifically, and the three of us encountered methodological challenges while doing our research in terms of access to the organization, the secrecy we encountered using the documents of this organization. And so we keep this in very three kind of different settings. Lucile is working, for instance, on thematization and securitization in Haiti. Leah is working on civil society at the UN and myself is working on site diversity at UN headquarters. So these are 3 pictures of our kind of field work. So the 3 of us keep asking this question: do we need a specific methodology while doing our research on IOs? In other words, do we need to adapt the methods, the tools that we have at our disposal to research this organization? What are exactly the concrete methodological challenges that we have and how to overcome them? And trying to answer this question, we are looking at the academic literature, of course, and we didn't find the answer that we were searching for in the academic literature. Of course, as students, as researchers, we all have access to many handbooks on global governance or international organizations, but these volumes do not put reflections on methodologies at the center of the book. On the other hand, we have many handbooks on specific methods, the interviews, survey research, I don't know, social discourse, social network analysis. But again, the illustrations from the specific context of international organizations are not provided. What we observe, however, is kind of emerging literature in international relations on methods, methodologies applied to specific fields, be, for instance, critical security studies. Also, we have new volumes on qualitative methods in IR. But still, back in 2018, when we started this journey, we couldn't find any proper illustration, discussion on methods in IO studies, specifically to IO studies. So from this, we decided, together with Émilie Deron, he's not here today, to start organizing a workshop. First, to see if we were not the only one asking these questions, but more seriously, just to bridge, to gather scholars researching IOs as a common research object to engage a conversation around methods. So we organized two-day workshop at the University of Geneva back in 2018. That was a very nice success. We had we had a call for contributions. We had many abstracts, and we ended up having more than 70 participants over 2 days from 11 countries, organized in 14 panels and 2 plenary roundtables. And what stands out at the end of the workshop is first, of course, a need to continue this conversation around methods, and also, of course, that we felt that that a publication would be needed just to continue and to go further with us on this topic. What we wanted also, what was really important for us, is to bring reflexivity into in the IO studies when we speak on methods. So that was one point that was really important for us, and also to be as inclusive as possible and to bridge different academic communities, be linguistic, be disciplinary, and that was to have the most representative book as possible of what's going on in the field of IO studies. And another kind of starting point of this book is also to kind of not reconcile, but at least to bring together various epistemologies, visions of science into this volume. So we understand methods as both a tool, of course, to collect, generate, analyze our data, but also as performative in the sense that they provide us with a certain view of the world. So for us, it was very important to have into one volume to bridge these 2 different perspectives. And finally, so overall, we hope that this book invites the reader to be what we call methodologically self-conscious. And what we mean with that is just to be aware that the methodological choices that we made have consequences on the production and dissemination of knowledge, and that the methods that we select for one reason or the other allows us to grasp certain aspects, certain phenomena of IOs, of governance, but also lead to us to ignore certain aspects that we want to be aware of that. So that's all the kind of the ideas behind this book, our desires also. And now we're gonna take you through the publication process the long journey, and Leah will talk you about.
Thank you very much, Fanny, for this great introduction. So it was important for us also to share with you the process, because a book obviously doesn't happen or come out of nowhere. And so it was important also to be able to unpack the process, to sort of demystify perhaps the different steps that are long, and that we've also in the meantime, experienced the pandemic. So that also had consequences on how we were going to reorganize our work around this. So let's start with what happens once the conference is here, once we're done with the conference, and we really, really recognize growing traction around the question of methods. What can we do with that? So we conceptualize a book. We come with a book proposal, combining all the different inputs that we have throughout the conference, the two-day conference and workshops, with very interesting inputs from colleagues from around the world. And so 6 months to 8 months later, we finally have a first version of the book proposal with invitations to potential contributors. So we took time to propose a coherent, what would be a book, a handbook, which was really important to us as a companion for students, junior scholars, later scholars, accomplished scholars, to have as a witness to what has been going on. So February 2019 is the finalization of the book proposal. So then many different steps come in 2019, and we meet each other again, and then we go to conferences, and we pitch. We have our elevator pitch, and we printed our proposal, and finally in April 2020. So we're already almost 2 years after the conference. We signed a contract with a university press that we thought was interesting, because we also wanted to gain credibility. Well, we wanted our authors or our contributors to want to accept, and having a university press in a chapter in a university press enhance the likelihood for contributors to want to participate. So there was also this instrumental idea around having a university press. But anyway, we signed the contract in April 2020. And at the end of 2021, we finally have the second round of revisions of each contribution, each box that we had reread, resubmitted to the contributors. We did an internal review process amongst ourselves during the pandemic, and I think it's important to put that to the fore, because it required a lot of collaboration on behalf of us, but also the contributors. So we also want to thank all of you for your time and patience. This is a screenshot. It's an anecdote, but it's also important in showing the ways we collaborate and the ways we get to an edited volume or common project. So this is a software called Trello. It's an open access, right? Free software. And we divided the software into, the document into the different parts. And as you see, we had different colors associated to whether it had been gone through the first round of review, second or third, who was in charge, who had the lead on what chapter. And when you clicked on each of the little inputs, you would have like our comments and our different comments for the contributors, but also our internal comments to see who's going to get in touch and do the follow-up. So for future references, this is a very interesting tool also. And it allows us to keep a good eye on the process and to not lose track of who has written to whom and who hasn't read what box or what contribution. Finally, so we're in 2021, finally in 2022, so 2 years after having signed the first contract, we have the final approval to publish by the executive committee. And that means, again, it's one other milestone that we've achieved and that is close to the finalization. And yet, still not. Because then we selected the book cover, which was much fun, well, also a lot of fun. And finally, August 2023, after over 5 years of working on this, we have it in our hands, and we're so happy to be able to share this. Lucile, you want to continue? Yeah, jump in, continue. Tell us what's in the book.
Yes, so now you've seen a bit how we came up with the idea, the process of putting together this book. So now, what can you expect opening this book? So first, we have 3 types of contribution. The first one is chapters. Chapters are dedicated to one method or a set of methods, and they explain all the chapters have the same structure: a what section, a why section, a how section, and what challenges. Giving them at the end additional references. So the idea is really to give an overview of the method, what it is, why would you use it in your studies, and how do you apply it in the specific context of internationalization, and then ending up on some challenges and how to overcome them. And so that's, I would say, like in terms of number, we have like the majority of the book is this type of chapters. Then you have boxes, which are smaller, but they give like more specific methodological tools and tricks. Concrete example, here you have on the top is the picture from Julian Ekel's box, which is on the analysis of artifacts. So you have 500 words talking about how do you analyze an artifact in the context of internationalization studies. Below that, you have the graph that has been produced by Benoît Maertens for the box that is dedicated to the analysis of maps. So here, again, it's a very specific entry point, but that gives some tricks to actually start the conversation of analyzing this very specific production in the context of internationalization. And finally, we have interludes. Here they are like those, like a way to address controversial or cross-method issues, and they conclude the different sections because all of these contributions are sorted out in what we think as a coherent and narrative volume, but with contributions that can also be read as standalone pieces. So you don't need to read it from A to Z, even though we would really appreciate it if you do. Still, each contribution can be read by themselves. So how did we structure the book? We have 5 sections that are dedicated to a family of methods. And the way that we organize them is because we identified so it's types of methods in the way you do research, but also in the type of question you can ask, in the type of data you can collect or generate to produce specific knowledge depending on the puzzles you want to address. So in the first section, observing, you can see on the right, you have the table of content for each part, and then I'm going to give you a bit of what's inside. So in this section, so the different methods related to observation are very good methods to be able to observe power dynamics, but also to unpack organizational culture, also in the way that you can be feeling at a bodily level of the practices, the routines, the experiences of individuals. And it's also all those methods that are able to question the meaning that actors give to their action. The second section about interviewing. Here you have different types of ways to conduct interviews, and what we've seen in the different chapters and entries in this part is that you can really collect data to gather information about past events, also individuals' life stories, but you can also study perception thanks to interviews. You can investigate institutional discourses and professional narratives. The third part is entitled documenting. Here, it's really about the document production, the way that internationalization produces documents, but also artifacts, pictures, and different types of statistics or maps. But it's not only about the production, but also the inner workings that you can understand based on focusing on those types of production. You can explore the elaboration, the creation, the dissemination of the production, but also their content and their broader effects.
The fourth section is dedicated to measuring. Here, the different methods that are like presented in the chapters and the boxes provide ways and tools to do a systematic description of a phenomenon. Is to be able to analyze across over time and across many units, ability also to understand causal relations, and finally to size interaction between actors in a very systematic way. So here different, again, methods that can help you answer questions related to that. And finally, the final section is entitled Combining. And here it's different types of methods. You have methods that actually need different methods to be implemented, like in the case of process tracing, for example. So it's one method that's actually combining different methods to collect the data to be able to do the process tracing. But you have also chapters where you combine different methods and you try to understand what it means to combine them together. What does it do in terms of providing more validity? Can they complement each other? Can they extend the results derived from one method? So basically, that's our part is done. Thank you very much for being here, and we look forward to more discussion with our contributors that agreed to be there with us, and also with our discussants that are going to be sharing their also insight.
Leah for providing us with such a comprehensive overview. It's never easy to summarize 400 pages of work in such a little 20 minutes. So I think it's always good to see what's behind, because we only see the final product, but then all the challenges, all the difficulties, and also, it really seems that you enjoy the process also. So it's great to see. But so now we have more time to discuss with the contributors first. And also maybe to come back to some of the elements we were mentioning, Fanny, at the beginning on reflexivity and how methods are much more than gathering tools, but that are performative. So I'll maybe start with you, Karin, with our first question. So you wrote 2 chapters, and where you presented first a method and then a combination of methods. So in the chapters, you explain the rationale behind the methods. You also discuss the practical implications and also the challenges associated with them. So first, can you tell us a little bit more about the writing process? I'm thinking about the challenges that you might have encountered, but also it would be maybe good to hear from you about how you approach reflexivity more generally writing. And also a second question would be, so what do you think is the added value of such an original format?
Yeah, thank you for the questions and the invitation. And I think I will first mention very briefly what the chapters were about, and so then I can answer the questions. So we had 2 chapters. One I wrote myself, the combining interviews and observation, and the other was with my colleague, Fanny Badache. And we targeted more direct observations. As some of you know, you can have a more kind of active role in how you study international organizations, but you can also just be an observer and have a passive role where you try not to intervene in the negotiating process. And also something that is, I think, important to note is that also the book is really about international organization. We might think formal, big, old organizations. I think what is also interesting with the book is that it brings also scholars that have been working also on negotiating processes. And for myself, I work on international negotiation, and Svenja as well. She studied the making of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I've been working on international climate negotiations and science policy interfaces. And I think what is very interesting with the kind of ethnographic and observation kind of methods is that the fact that you don't necessarily look at the outcome, but you look at the process through which a decision, a document is going to be produced. And you look at the practices and discourses around negotiations. I think also something that was interesting I found with the combination between interviews and observation is to try to show how you have what you're being told when you do an interview, and then what you see when you yourself has access to an international organization or institution. And it's often very difficult and very different. And that's why in this chapter, for instance, I mentioned the kind of state management that you see, where you have something you are being told that is often the kind of official discourse, and then when you have access to the negotiations themselves, you see a kind of completely other view of what's going on. And I think that's very interesting in a way. And the writing process, I think, was interesting in the sense that I needed to make sense of practices and processes that I have myself built over the years that sometimes are really more based on gut feeling. One of the things with more kind of ethnographic insights is that there are methods, there are debates that you can have with colleagues, but you cannot see everything. It's always going to be situated depending on when you access a negotiating process or an organization, depending on who is going to give you access, whether you are going to be part of a negotiating team or whether you are going to be an observer, who you are going to meet in the corridors and is going to give you access to some rooms or not. You have to make choices. And so for me, it was a bit challenging to try to find some kind of consistency in something that often is really depends on the moment and making a decision. I'm going to go to see this room or this institution and not the other. And sometimes it's really about how you feel. There might be something interesting, and sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. So it's important to reflect on that. And I try to also a lot in my practice to be very, I think that's one of the questions about being reflexive, especially with that kind of method. You just being in a way humble and modest about the achievement of the limits of the methods as well. And that's why the kind of situated perspective that is important. A way that we found, and Lucile has done it, for instance, as well with colleagues for COP21, and I've tried it with colleagues for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and COP27, is to actually use collaborative event ethnography, which is a way where you are 6 or 7 scholars working on different topics, but going all together to the same event and trying to cover as much as possible, having sometimes very different questions, but also sometimes the same question. For instance, at COP27, we just follow the same actors, small island developing states, throughout the negotiations in different instances. And so that's so kind of way, I think, to also maybe bring more validity to the knowledge and to what we produce. And maybe a last point is I think this book is very interesting in terms of learning that different methods are going to lead to different questions as well. So, and different epistemology. I'm very inductive. I go to the field and first see what is there before then trying to get some theory out. And this is also something that is, I think, very relevant for the book, that you read that methods are very important because they will influence the questions that you are going to ask as well as the results that you are going to have.
Thank you, Kari. I think it's very insightful, especially when you talk about the challenges when we conduct participant observation in IOs, right? And you mentioned stage management or official discourses, and also the issue of access, which is extremely challenging also sometimes. And this allows me now to transition to Valérie. I would like to ask you a similar question, but I know that you come from a different angle and you wrote a chapter on visual methods, which are a very unique type of method. So you presented a box, so in the book, and you zoomed in on different visual archives, and your call was for more methodological innovation, right? So from your perspective, what methods do you think should be revisited and how? And which IO artifacts and multilateral practices you think would deserve more attention and also more methodological innovation?
Thank you. Well, it's quite difficult in 5 minutes to kind of put a spotlight on specific innovations, and given the extent of very different methodological approaches we have in the book, I wouldn't like to create a list, but more to adopt self-reflexive points, as you mentioned in the introduction. So just as an anecdote, but just before I was approached by the editors to write the chapter and the box about visual methods and visual archives, I actually had a discussion with image archivist at the International Committee of the Red Cross. So my background, I'm a historian and I work mainly in humanitarian context and humanitarian organizations. And one of the image archivists at the ICRC told me that, oh, now that we have all of our visual archives online, no one is using them. Is it a problem of ignorance? Is it a problem of neglect? Is it a problem of methodologies? So I would say that from my own perspective, I really wanted to emphasize the need for researchers to focus more on visual methods, given that these methods are as broad as any qualitative or quantitative approach. You can adapt either a qualitative or quantitative approach with images. But it's not only a question of methods, it's also understanding visual practices, visual strategies, visual politics. And it's a very interesting way to approach power dynamics and power relations within the international organization world. Given, of course, also the extensive improvements that have been put by IOs also to digitalize their own archives. And more access doesn't mean more use by researchers. So that's, I think it's a very important point. There's no like democratization of research on IOs because everything is online. In terms of methods revisited, I think here I would like to think more about what you mentioned, methodologies as reflexive tools, self-reflexive tools, and performative tools. I think here there's a need to consider, I saw on the table of content that someone wrote a book about interviewing beneficiaries. And I think here the need to think about more participative methods is very important because it helps to revisit, I would say, current trends or discussions or issues that that are going on in the international organization world, such as power dynamics, the question of inclusion, the question of equity, and the question of invisibility. And it shows that researchers should not be immune to these trends and accept them for what they are, so acknowledging their own biases when they adopt specific methods and the way they approach people they're going to work with or work about. So I think here it relates also to the question of the positionality you have as a researcher, not just the positionality you have depending on the role you will adopt, because I think some of the contributors were not only researchers, they also work within an organization. But I also think about the positionality in more sociological terms, which means the role you have, the position you have in the society. And I think that's very important, considering also very important social movements that are not completely immune to the international world. I would say also the question of ethics. There are many discussions going on right now in the visual world of international organization about the consent of populations and people to have their image taken. And I think in general, the whole issue of consent relates to the ethical approach to research. Of course, there's already a lot of contribution on this, but I think reimagining ethics in a world that is mainly digitized and in which we have such a circulation of images online is very important. And the question of consent is really becoming quite huge beyond the visual methods. Now, in terms of artifacts and new multilateral practices, it's hard to say which artifacts can be related to innovative approaches. Being a historian, for example, it always fascinates me that the United Nations have no museum, except a very small room inside the UN building in Geneva. And in terms of what's being publicly displayed in terms of artifacts in this museum, given the quantity of artifacts that the UN must have, where are these artifacts? They're in their archives, but in terms of what's visible, what's invisible, what's openly displayed, if one day the United Nations in Geneva and in New York would have to create a museum, what would they do? What would they use? That would be really interesting. But as a researcher, you can also consider, what would I do if I had to create this museum? That would be really interesting in terms of which artifacts do you want to use. If you want to focus on the past, you want to focus on the present. I think also in terms of the whole question that's going on also right now, especially in humanitarian organizations, about the need to decolonize humanitarian action, for example. What about decolonizing research as well? And there's a strong emphasis generally when we do research on international organization. Most of the time, people will think about headquarters, places where you will have, top decision makers, where you have archives, where you have collections, where you have libraries, where you have documents. But we forget that international organizations also, you can see them, you can observe them, you can interview people working with them in field activities in places that do not relate to the headquarters in the global north. So the question of finding ways to think about international organizations without always linking them with their places of power is important. And I think here there's also a very important contribution of anthropology in terms of revisiting everyday practices, everyday rituals, which might not seem very important, but they actually define our routines and our practices every day. And to finish, I think what's also striking to me, I've been recently visiting the renovated places inside the UN, and the use of architecture is mentioned several times throughout the book, but not that much. I think architecture could be another way to think about a methodological approach. If you simply look at who has paid for renovating the UN, and you visit some of the new meeting rooms, you will see that it's Qatar and the Emirates. And using architecture as another tool for soft diplomacy is very interesting in this case. Not only the use of images in this room, but how the setting of a room is actually quite relevant to think about geopolitics and emerging, we call them emerging donors in humanitarian action, but I would say emerging superpowers in geopolitical instances. So these are just ways to think about current debates going on in political sciences in general and international relations in the humanitarian sector, to which researchers should not be immune and consider how much this might affect their work, the biases they have, and the new possibilities it can give them in terms of methodologies.
Thank you, Valerie, for your input. I think you covered a lot of important topics that I think we should take into account as researchers, also related to also the political economy of knowledge production, right? Ethics and all of this key also to what we do. And also, I think fundamentally also the important to move beyond text, your own contribution. And sometimes it's true that we lack the tools and we don't know where to start with an image, how to analyze it, how to capture power dynamics, hierarchies. So I think your chapters are key contributions to those debates. Thank you for that. And let me now move on to Annabelle. And I think it's also a good transition because you're also speaking about power and how to capture it. And Annabelle, you also touch upon this topic in your chapter on interviewing. So you say that interviews are not simply neutral tools to collect data, right? But actually you describe some of the controversies associated with this type of methods. So I have two main questions to ask you. The first one is, why do you think it's important to reflect on interviewing in the context of IO studies? And the second one is, if you could perhaps highlight some of the critical questions that you think scholars should consider when using this specific type of method.
Thanks, Juanita, and thanks also for inviting me to contribute to the volume and to speak about my contribution here today. It's been a pleasure. So yes, as Juanita just mentioned, I talk about interviewing in my chapter. So in a way, it's a method which has long been used in order to research IOs. So perhaps it's less innovative than some of the methods that have been discussed in the volume. However, although there is a long practice of interviewing, I think it does need to be handled with a lot of care. I think interviews are quite unique as a method of collecting or creating data, depending on how you look at them, precisely because they consist of an encounter between two individuals. And as such, they necessitate, I would argue, a deep reflection on this relationship between the researcher and the interviewee. And whatever interview technique you use, whether it's more structured or less structured and so on, interviews always consist of this encounter. So I think they can be thought of as a family of methods for that very reason. I think that's what connects all different techniques across the spectrum of ways of interviewing officials working for IOs. So I'll start saying that as a way of bringing up two critical questions, which I discuss in the chapter and which I would like to briefly introduce to you today, which I think one should ask himself or herself while conducting interviews. Of course, there are all sorts of other questions which you may also ask yourself, like how to get access, how to write the questions, how to prepare, how to present your research. So, and of course, they are not only practical, those other questions, they are also like more fundamental questions which may inform them. But I have decided not to focus on them because there is already a lot there. When you read an interview, a chapter on interviews, sorry, you would typically find advice on that. So here I've decided to focus more on two aspects. So first on how you understand the relationship between the interviewer and the interviewee and how that reflects on debates on what you make of the interview material. And second, I will talk a little bit about power dynamics as Juanita indicated. So interview material is perceived as unique, extremely valuable, but also we often hear that it is subjective. Sometimes we hear the word biased, or often we use that it is a partial account of a story. Indeed, when highly ranked officials working for IOs, for instance, we've all experienced this sensation that they might be sticking to an official discourse and not let us know about what is happening behind the scenes. Or sometimes we've also all felt that they are very deeply immersed in the culture of the organization which they work for, and of course that may affect the stories which they are telling us. So how to deal with this subjectivity very much depends on your epistemological perspective as a scholar and what you ask to the interview text. For some scholars who work maybe from a more positivist perspective, the partiality of these interview stories is an issue. So then scholars will be asked to control interview material, to perhaps interview other people in order to triangulate the stories they hear, or perhaps control with other kinds of data, not interviews, but documents and observations of some kind. So in a way, the scholar is asked to take distance from the interviewee and his or her words. Not only the subjectivity of the interviewee, but the fact that the interview material is produced through an encounter between two subjective human beings is seen as in need of solving. This perspective, however, can be questioned if you work from a more perhaps interpretivist perspective. Here, the interest of the scholar consists instead of capturing those specific stories for what they are. And here you can ask yourself new questions, maybe, for example, how problems are understood by IO officials. So I think Lucile at some point was saying that interviews are important when you want to study perceptions. So it can be perceptions of social reality, of the world, of specific problems, whether it's education, poverty, health, and so on. So here, if your interest is very much to capture these perceptions, of course, the standpoint of the interviewer does not need to be overcome, and of the interviewee do not need to be overcome any longer. There is no need for the scholar to take distance from the interviewee so as to remain neutral, or to control the interview material against other types of evidence. Instead, the advice there would be to make a bit more explicit the subjective elements which may inform your questions as a scholar and the way you interpret your interview material. So depending on what questions are asked by scholars to the interview text or material, the relationship between the interviewee and the interviewer will be apprehended very differently. So I think the first advice I would give is to think a little bit about those deeply epistemological questions before you go out and conduct interviews. Second, I would also like to talk a little bit about power dynamics. They are also very much related to the fundamental nature of interviews as an encounter between two individuals. Precisely because interviews involve a dialogue, a conversation between two individuals, asymmetries might be present. And of course, when you conduct interviews with IO officials, be highly ranked, may have a lot of social capital, cultural capital, and so on, to use Dieuzian terminology, most textbooks would tell us that typically your interviewees would have more power than you do as an interviewer, and that the advice typically would focus on perhaps how to change those power dynamics so that you do not end up with a failed interview, somebody who hasn't talked to you or has not talked to you about what you are interested in as a scholar. Of course, this is a dimension, and I think we've all had interviews when we had this sense that we were not able to conduct the interview as we intended. However, I think it is important to remind scholars that power asymmetries can also be in our favor as scholars, simply because of the nature of the interview and behavior. The interview is taking place for our own purposes as scholars. First of all, we have an interest in conducting interviews for the purpose of our research. As a result, of course, we set the questions. We decide what to ask. We may not be fully transparent on our research questions, what we are really interested in. So there's some knowledge which we may have and our interviewee does not have it. Second, as researchers, we also mainly control the interpretation of the interview text. Of course, there have been attempts discussed in the literature to co-produce knowledge and so on, but I think that in the end, your interviewees do not write your articles and papers. And I think this gives us a lot of power, which is not often discussed and not often considered. We interview elites. Nevertheless, they can also be vulnerable. They have careers. They can be harmed by what we write about them and so on. So I think it is very much important to consider these power relations in all their complexity and reflect upon it before you go to the interview, but also when you write afterwards. So I would really encourage all scholars who conduct interviews to think beyond questions of how to find interviewees and how to ask questions, but also think about these more perhaps fundamental epistemological issues and power dynamics which relate again to the nature of the interview. Thanks.
Thank you, Annabelle. What I found very valuable in your chapter, and also now your intervention, is actually, as you were saying, how if we approach interviews as something relational and intersubjective, then we can see them as something different, and we can also capture the more invisible aspects when we interview people, and the power relations and the different ways in which it can affect also the generation of knowledge more broadly. So now I thank the three contributors for their insights. I think what maybe emerged as a common theme is that actually research is very messy, right? It's a messy practice, and it's also methods are not there to get rid of this or to eliminate this messiness, but actually to be able to navigate it in a different way. So now, after having heard from the contributors, now let's move on to the second section of our discussion and engagement with the book. So I'll start with Sandra. A question for you. I'll perhaps ask you two more general questions, not on specific methods, but more broad questions. So how do you see the current state of discussions on methods in the field of IO studies? And why do you think we had to wait until 2023 to see a handbook on IO research methods? And second, what were the major contributions of the volume, and what do you think is still missing?
It's a lot. And this is perhaps also what I will do a little bit, because this book is so incredibly inspiring. First of all, it has an introduction in the subtitle, right? But we're also talking about a handbook, and we could talk about a toolbox, and we could talk about an agenda. Perhaps you have taken some time to decide about the subtitle. I would be interested to hear back from you why you decided in the introduction. Certainly it fits too, but it's not only an introduction. And yes, these chapters are very short, but very crisp, and they are a starting point to engage with a method that you didn't think about or you didn't know, and I've gathered so much inspiration just from skimming through it. So I'm sure it will travel a lot, this book, and be very helpful. Now, you asked why did it take so long, or why did we have to come to 2023 to have this handbook toolbox introduction? And honestly, at the personal level, I think it needed you. It needed a new generation of young scholars who don't have blinkers from theoretical schools and methodological schools, but who are really genuinely interested in the object of inquiry and are able and interested to see, first of all, and then to appreciate other approaches, right? I mean, there have always been other approaches in the field of IR and IO studies. Well, I speak from the perspective of a political scientist trained in international relations as a subdiscipline. It was pretty, in German we would say, übersichtlich, right? What you do in IR with regard to international institutions for a long time. And we didn't look much beyond the own subdiscipline, and this is really what you have done, reaching out to anthropology, sociology more generally. And my dear colleague here is Mathilde Bournier is also here, who is studying international organizations from the point of view of sociology at the university. Visual arts, communication studies. I don't know all the backgrounds of your authors, but it's very rich and very diverse. So it needed this openness, and I congratulate you for this, and I'm really happy about this new generation coming into our institutions and finding their place in our institutions as well. And then, of course, there's in the discipline a broader trend of opening up in how we look at international organizations, that they are not only arenas, but they are acting themselves. Okay, this is not so new, but the bureaucratic studies perspective, administrative studies perspective, I think this is still pretty new. to look at the routines, the standard operating procedures, the idiosyncrasies of international organizations as entities of their own, and not only through the games of the constituencies of international organizations. So here we have also in disciplinary terms, public administration studies, bureaucratic studies that enter the field of international relations and IO studies more generally. And then, of course, the plurality of international relations approaches that reflects a bit the types of disciplines that you also mobilize in your book, that the discipline as such is becoming more diverse and fluid towards other disciplines of the social sciences. And with this also, I think this trend is also linked to a less Western-centric, Eurocentric, Anglo-centric worldview, and this genuine wish to open up to other perspectives and voices. So this is my take on where we stand and why you are so innovative in bringing together these approaches. Now, you asked me what is missing. I would not say what is missing. I would maybe say what could be next steps. So what is missing, you already in the introduction list a few things, right? So I'm not original when I say one could engage more with social media and digitalization and communication via digital media more broadly, and there's also another one that you highlight. Surveys and field experiments to study the formation of preferences, beliefs, and so on. Okay, these are very good ideas. Another one that I thought of, also listening to Valérie, and I looked a bit at your chapter with images and visual methods. There are so many debates and debates in particular which are filmed today of what happens in the international organizations, and this is an incredible source, I think, as well for more visual methods of communication, also to get at emotions. This is another big trend in the discipline, the study of emotions in political processes, study gestures, study tonality. I think this is also forthcoming and could be added to the collection. Now, maybe with some more distance for the next book, the agenda. You have already in your presentation systematized quite a bit the research questions that link up with the different parts of the book, how it is structured. But I think this could be developed even a bit further. On the one hand, to ask, what do international organizations, what do international organizations do, and which methods allow us to study what type of activities? And the other dimension would be, how do international organizations do different things? And this could help to systematize the more detailed research questions and approaches, what they are good at, what they are less good at. So if we ask, what do international organizations do, then we could start along the policy cycle, agenda setting, formulation, decision-making, implementation, enforcement, evaluation, and linked with this also the communication between the international organization and its environments, the whole question of legitimacy generation, authority generation, right, that comes in. And then the other dimension would be, how do they do it? Do they do it more through power mechanisms, more through deliberation, persuasion, learning? Is it or emulation, these kinds of copying and just acting in routines without really being much aware of what one is doing, without much. So these kinds of issues, I think the different methods that you mobilize here would yeah, come together in a very productive manner. Yes, then there's a question of epistemology also. What are these methods good for? What do they try to achieve in terms of explaining or understanding social phenomena? And Annabelle has already spoken about it, and it's especially in her interlude that this is really well worked out, where the chapters as such, some do less, right, engage with these more epistemological dimensions. So yeah, it's not really a suggestion, because you have the interludes exactly for this reason. And it would have become double the size if you had an interlude for each method. But it's definitely a direction that takes this agenda further. And the third one, yeah, and here I think my old IR scholar identity comes through theories of international relations, theories of international organizations, how they relate to the different methodological approaches. Yeah, and whether this methodological toolbox travels well across all theoretical approaches, or whether there's not certain orientation and more constructivist approaches that take international organizations as actors of their own, and with their independence and idiosyncrasies. So something like this. But all in all, yeah, it's a major achievement, and very inspiring. This is yeah, why these questions are raised in the first place.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you for sharing your insights also on the many possible avenues for research. And I think in particular, as you said, how do IOs do things and how do they do it? But for that we have Francesco. Guidance on that. But so Francesco, as someone who is kind of on the other side working in IO, how do you perceive IO research in the social sciences? And a question that maybe for us as researchers would be helpful to hear your insights on is how can we innovate methodologically and for what purpose? And maybe it will be also good to hear from you if you see any room for improvement in the future.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I think that this is mind-blowing. It's very, very interesting. It's actually an area of research that the more you explore, the more you look at the horizon expanding in front of you. I think this could be the feeling that I would imagine a researcher in IO would have. In a sense, also an historian, just look in a different way. And I was really inspired by listening to you. I think that in this question, the word that lights up in my mind is purpose. Okay, so I want to tackle for what purpose. But before I go into that, as a premise, so looking at time, because you should never ask a UN person to talk last. So it's 17:20, I will speak until I will talk until 28. So first, we have to acknowledge that there is a separation. You also said you are from the other side. I don't suffer from discriminatory syndrome, so it's fine. But I could also not be fine. So what makes you say is that there is de facto sort of permeability around every cell. If you look at the IO as a cell, as a body. So as research goes, you go and peek into or try to open the doors that you find on the structure. So you go around the sphere and you find handles here, what's in here, what's in here. You're already at the stage of researching why the door is here and now here. Then once you start peeking into any IO, you may see member states at work. That's the first step. So any IO is a reflection of Westphalian understanding of the absolute supremacy of the state entity in all realities you can imagine. Then, if you pick from another window, you see people like workers working for this system. And then you see other behaviors and other answers to interviews. And that, for example, in the UN Secretariat, we talk Thomas Wies, or Bias if you prefer. He hates Bias, so Thomas Wies talks about the first UN, the member states, the second staff, the third UN, all of us. So I'm second UN, the third UN at the same time. I go on holiday, I'm a third UN citizen. I care about what we could do or what we're not doing. So these cells are built, they have a coating so that they can look at research as an externality. A little bit like you running a big corporation and the feeling you have when you read about yourself in the newspapers. Yeah, but those people don't really, they're not the game. They're looking at it. And here I can show this improbability being a way of fact, because each organization has to justify first of all itself to itself. So, given that as a premise, purpose is what interests me a lot, because continuing, I'm happy this is an introduction. For me, this is a guide. But this is an introduction, I'm happy because we have to continue, because the purpose could be to make research better. Better research leads always to something, but also to make IOs better, because the moment it's beginning now, IOs now have a collective intelligence that allows them to understand that they can become better. You have researchers that buy into that dynamic. You mentioned there on the slide there was Thomas Wies as a name, there was Rodonio as another name, there was something Cott as another name. So these are researchers that are, in my opinion, angled that way. Let's help these creatures to understand that they can for better. So I won't talk a lot about what could improve research, because I'm not a researcher. I've done that very little in my early years as a student. I never became a scholar. But there are a couple of things I want to mention, maybe three. One is the interdisciplinary approach. We have to push much more on that. So IOs are like entities that are used to be looked at by political scientists and by IR specialists. When you start looking at it, I was reading books on the anthropological end, which is very interesting. And so when you start looking at it from other disciplines, that could be a way of improving research. The second is mixed methods. Mixed methods for me is another way to improve. And you mentioned a lot of these things that I've been thinking about when you asked the question to me. The question was provided to me personally, so it would be too hard for me to invent all of this now. Data and transparency. You also mentioned it from a historian point of view. I totally agree. I'm not sure I agree that with digitization doesn't turn into a matter for research. I actually tend to take the opposite approach based on data, on the experience of digitizing 40 million pieces of paper from the League of Nations archive. And the way researchers are now researching the League of Nations is much better and much more effective in the United Nations that don't have that kind of digital availability. So democratization, I won't go into that. I don't know if it's a question of risk or not. I think it's a question of access. I like access over democratization. It's also easier to achieve. So a promise of access is something that we could obtain from international organizations. And I care a lot about that. So I think that our project was called NOTAP really changed a reality that would select researchers depending on who can afford flying to Geneva, sleeping in Geneva, eating in Geneva, to protect you. So, and the last one on improving research is digital and big data analytics, things that now we can do by mixing technologies, and that tells you something. So I totally agree with social media. Even natural language fast analysis, I think it could teach the IO a lot. So here you go, it's 17:27 already. So let me mention rather now what kind of research items could improve. So this thing I said, I think would improve research. The next three would improve actually how IOs measure the impact, or maybe perhaps even the impact of IOs. And the first impact assessment. So we research a lot of things, but every IO, I'm talking to humanitarian historian, I started with humanitarian sector, and then I moved on, moved on. How you measure yourself engenders a narrative on how good you are. And that there is a lot of work to be done there, in my opinion. So developing really robust methodologies for impact assessment from its external, from the other side, it's for me, would help international organizations to have a better portrayal of themselves. Policy relevance is all masters being created in a system that has changed. Are we relevant in the same way? Maybe you create a narrative where you're relevant here on this thing, and 50 years on, you're relevant somewhere else, without you even knowing. I could give examples, but in the interest of time and my own safety, I won't. So the third is innovation or conflict resolution. Conflict resolution is one of those bastions of old-style IR with an enormous emphasis on Westphalian power projection, etc. So without going to the subtleties of it, can we accept that there has been, talking in the past, a massive power shift? Can we acknowledge that? And once we acknowledge that, can we now look at conflict resolution in a fresher way? I think those things are perhaps spaces which research IOs can reach through this thing that makes you say, I'm from the other side. So there must be ways. What is the risk? The risk is that some research may suggest some IOs have become redundant, irrelevant. Some others are actively making themselves. So maybe so I think that when you look at these impermeabilities, something to trip. It's like when you use an old tarpaulin and it's still impermeable, but it drips, right? So I think you have to continue. I'm grateful that this book exists, and I can tell you that it's in the collection of the library. So I got the copy, and it's going to be so yeah, those are as openly as I can, frankly.
Thank you, Francesco. Thanks a lot. And there's definitely a lot of work to do. And I found it really inspiring when you were talking about this impermeability, right? And the boundary, what's up in the outside, the inside, and how you can navigate this. And also as researchers, I think we have to think through it. And I think the discussion could go on for hours, but I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions. Maybe I'll be taking 3 or 4 questions, and then we see how we go with time. Could you just please briefly introduce yourself and also try to keep it concise to give the opportunity for everyone to participate. Thank you.
I'm Leah. I'm an associate professor in human rights studies at Lund University, and I'm a legal anthropologist. So this is the anthropological viewpoint. So congratulations on the book. I actually teach methods at our interdisciplinary human rights program, and I can very much see myself taking this book on. And also Master Folios Fellow, so very inspiring for the future. So the one question that I had is, maybe if you could say a little bit more about how you define IOs. And this sort of builds on what Sandra was saying, how for a lawyer, it's actually quite easy because you start with a legal abstraction and that's kind of the end of it. But for an anthropologist, of course, it's very different. So it's more a field of action. So in my own work, I've been doing field work at the UN Human Rights Committee. I quickly realized that it doesn't make much sense to approach the committee as its 18 members, because actually when you examine what goes on empirically, it's 18 members in this legal abstraction, and potentially for its members, even though they are very well aware of how they are dependent on the UN Secretariat. So how do you define it? I've come to define them more as a community of practice. So you talked a lot about how these practices and documented cycles, they are constitutive of their practices. So what to you and for this book are IOs?
One behind you.
So first, I note that we have identified the future director of the museum for the UN. Heard it here first. So I have like 8-7 questions. So with your insights and like substantial insights, going towards what you just said, where are IOs currently going, and which changes could make them go where else? And then in order to interpret the outputs of the IOs, would it be possible through research to generate involuntary disclosures of participants in the IO process? Because I see a lot of persons that are present that aren't present about in the UN processes and negotiations, etc. And they all have some kind of agenda. And then they have investments, they have allegiances, they have any kind of liabilities, dependencies, etc. And these inform what they do there, what they express there. And then an analysis of the scholarly work in a similar manner would be interesting. The impact of the state of exhaustion of delegates and also on their job security, of their job security on the outcomes, which you know. The meaning behind or intent behind the expressions used and the way the texts are structured and what is omitted in the light of the reference texts and the current state of affairs outside of the UN would be interesting to know. And actually, I need that information if anybody has that. And then things that happen in the room are a result of things that happen outside of the room in private conversations. How to infer or hypothesize which parts of the discussions are not in the texts or in the media. And yeah, lastly, about humanitarian action, do you have a feeling, I have a feeling that humanitarian issues are hitting back home right now. So it's like the states are becoming some sort of a humanitarian actors. So for your
The last question, then of course you can pick and select because you have 7 questions. But yeah, okay, Leah.
Thank you. Yes, Julia Bethwaite from Tampere University originally. Yes, super interesting. And I think especially also like taking us through the whole process of throwing ideas and wonderful to hear the very detailed path. My question is about this performative feature of methods and like the enacting the social, basically through methods. So what accounts of the world does this handbook have the potential to constitute? And for scholars who are studying IOs, what then would be especially important to take into account?
One wants to maybe respond, and then we can have a next round of questions.
Sure. And I don't know if it's also online.
Maybe I missed one question online. Yes.
Okay, so
you want me to read it now?
Okay, sure. So James Wall is asking, well, you deserve a rest after 5 years of putting this together. You are now standard bearer, for this research agenda, methods of IO. So how do you see this research agenda developing in the coming years?
Okay, I can jump in. You, yeah. Thanks a lot. Thanks you very much also for your feedback on the book. It was amazing to have like insights from also our readers. Maybe, I mean, thank you for all the questions. It's going to be difficult to address all of them in a like short time. So maybe just so the last question from that we got online from James Hall is one of our contributors. Thank you, hello James. So he wrote a box on languages and interviews. And I think it's the question about the research agenda. I just wanted to make an anecdote about the Trello. So we do have a card for the second edition of the book, where each time where the new ideas, oh, next time we need a box on that. Oh, maybe we should have a chapter on that. And so it's because already the ideas from you. We try to have a bit on that on the introduction, but yeah, I don't think this is the end of the road, even though it's a day to celebrate it. Maybe the question on how we define IOs, because this was a bit of a discussion that we had with also the evaluators. We had like book reviewers that were mandated by the press. And there was this question about the definition of IOs. And so the way we try to address that question in the introduction is being as inclusive again as we try to be in the table of content, opening like to very, I would say, like formal, usual definition around having a treaty, intergovernmental, having a budget and a headquarters, having staff, and having a purpose, for example, to more like constructivist definitions, saying that internationalization are social constructs that are provisory to answer like collective problems at a special time, and that you need to understand them in their context. So I think it really depends on the methods, it depends on the epistemology you want to adopt, but we try to make sure that everyone could see themselves in the book and knowing that you can use also different methods, even though they are not completely, I would say, legitimate in your epistemologies. And I think what the book is also trying to do, and I think it connects with the question of the innovation, why don't we use we don't use more about like videos or pictures. It's also a question of legitimacy in the academia. Like it's saying that it's completely legitimate to do your thesis building on a visual material, but we still have a very like hierarchical ways of understanding the primary sources that are legitimate to look at. But like popular fiction a few years ago was completely discredited, and now we know it's actually a field of study. So I think having this book to give like legitimacy to analyze tweets, to analyze maps, to analyze visual archives is also a way to open up the field in IO studies, I hope.
You want to go? Okay. I can pick one or two questions and try to answer them. One question raised by Madame on the, I think it was your second question, said about also the backgrounds and networks of like IO officials and bureaucrats. And so I think it's really interesting and important to also to know that. And personally, I'm very interested in understanding the socio-demographic background of like IO officials, also to understand where do they come from and what kind of networks they have in terms of professional experience, etc. So, and then by knowing that, by having this kind of data, so speaking from the methods point of view, I think you can then understand everything that you mentioned, where do they come from and what kind of relationship they have. So I think this is something that we should have more data on to really understand understand the points that you made. On the content of documents and how we can understand what's eluded or what's not in there. In the book, we have some chapters on it, just to try. And for instance, one advice of some contributors is to complement the study of documents with interviews or with observations, and so you can just understand the meaning of a word, the meaning of understand the background of the person or the organization, department who drafted the document. So having different methods to study one document could be an idea to really understand how it was built, drafted, etc. So in the book, that is open access, so everyone can access to it. You may find some answers on this. And finally, I want to say a word on Julia's question. I think the whole, and I can speak for the three of us, but the whole idea of this book is not to give a rigid and strict definition of the word. So the idea is really to be pluralistic, to be diverse, and that everyone can find what they're more familiar with, but also discover new ways of looking at the word, looking at IOs. So really this idea is not to give a specific account of the word, but in this volume you will find really different scholars with different backgrounds who really don't see IOs in the same way. And so you can just be curious and just acknowledge that. So the idea was not to give, maybe our account of the world is just diversity and inclusiveness. This is the account of the world that we want to share with everybody. Leah, do you have some insights and other questions?
I wanted to go back to what you were saying about what is visible and what is not made visible. And I think that's where it's interesting. Well, the book is sort of an invitation to be able to consider other questions, but also other ways of doing research maybe, and which obviously also opens up to different disciplines. And for example, the question of what is not made visible or what is ignored is a field in sociology of ignorance and production of knowledge that is very, that has been very much documented. So it's also an invitation for maybe different disciplines to be able to connect and to engage with one another, despite silos in universities, which really, try to get us into in one department versus another. But beyond the career sort of logics, we really would like to get people to with humility. Somebody talked about humility. Yeah, thank you. To engage further. And then James, he's left. Okay.
He's online.
Oh, he's still online? Oh, sorry, James. Well, how we see this going in the next couple of years? And I think we've had all, with the interventions of all our participants, a lot of food for thought. And I want to thank Sandra for having given us a whole new perspective of how we could have engaged or imagined the outline of this handbook companion agenda. Thank you very much, because we have anecdotes around the title. I don't know if somebody has. So we go back to the conference, and we had 2, 3, I would say back in the days we were much more junior, and we had mentors. And so we could also talk about mentorship in academia, but people we are very thankful for. And they were rooting for us. They were telling us, yes, you should do it. We believe in you. That's really the way to go. But first, finish your PhD. So that was always on the line. You'll have no legitimacy without your PhD. Okay, so we understood that. But so they were saying, but you should think about something that you can take along, that should be sort of like a companion. Yeah, it should be a companion. And then we get back to with the three of us, and we think, a companion, is that really what we want? I don't know. An agenda? We didn't talk about agenda, but I mean, that was obviously an underlying question. But how did we get to introduction?
I remember that the initial title was Introduction to International Organization Research Methods. And one of the reviewers told us, okay, you are doing a book on international organization and research methods, which also introduced a variety of methods. So this is why the introduction, I mean, you had in the book, you have an introduction to survey, to interviews, but you need to read, you need to go beyond our book to really understand what is interviewing an IO official or observing an IO. Of course, we don't say that it's enough, but it's a start, and it's also to discover. Yeah, it's a start. So that's why the reviewer advised some changing the order of the title.
So the underlying message is that, of course, there will be a next edition. Now, the question is when, under what circumstances, that has yet to be discussed.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe we can take a few more questions for the end.
15 minutes.
A second round of questions. Anyone maybe online?
Yeah, and a precision about what you just answered. When I said people at the UN, I didn't mean the IO officials. Like I'm not an IO official, but I am there. So there's a lot of people from the industry, etc.
Okay. So you can. Anyone else? Laura?
So Laura Kimber, I'm a research associate here at the Geneva Ready Institute at the Global Governance Center. First of all, congratulations. This is a tremendous accomplishment and one that is even more impressive if we consider that the ID came along like 6 years ago. So congratulations. One of the things that you mentioned is the COVID-19 and how it represented a challenge for you. And I'm interested in how it shaped your vision for the book, how it influenced the way you thought about researching organizations and presenting those methods to students and other researchers in the field, and what kind of opportunity it presented for you and for the book in general.
Thank you. Anyone else?
That's
Congratulations for 5 years of effort, which is resulting into this book. Before you jump into the discussion on the second edition, my question is, what is your dissemination plan? Mass distribution of physical copies, but reaching out the masses that there is a tool, there is a book which is available to the research audience. Because sometimes you end up making a very good product and that remains on the shelf for a long time.
Thank you.
Just wanted to add, if you first distribute it to the international organization staff, that would make our jobs really easier. Just so that they know it's not an easy job interviewing them.
Anyone online, Sylvia? No? Okay.
But maybe it's, I don't know if it's two questions in one. So, as you say, like there are many different understandings coming together about what is an IO and how you come together. So there's not a strictly agreed upon definition, but I'm wondering in terms of the specificity of the book, I know that there has to be one. What is it about IOs that necessitate its own research agenda in terms of method? What is it that separates, if anything, this book from any attempt at studying organizations that enact an element of the international of any sort, whether a corporation, an international NGO, an activist group, etc. Because I feel like the great myriad of practices that you describe in the book are also applicable for that, and that's, I don't think, a problem. It's an advantage in and of itself that it can. But is there anything that you will say this one aspect is what makes this field, as fleeting or as liquid as it may be, different than that?
Thank you. To respond.
You were going to do COVID? So I'm going to start with the last one. So definitely that was really a question for us. Do IO research methods exist? Or do we need specific methods for IOs? So that was a big question mark when we began this project. And what we found, reading all the contributions and the workshop, is that there is no specific IO research methods. Some methods that we know in social sciences can be applied directly when you research IOs. But you need for some, and I'll give you examples, there's a fluctuating degree of adjustment when you adopt some tools. So on the one hand, IOs are both banal research objects, and in other instances, they are peculiar. I give you an example. The analysis of voting is a very widespread method for domestic politics. You analyze voting in parliaments at the domestic level. Voting analysis. It's also very much used for IOs. You have the Security Council, the General Assembly for the UN. So there are many scholars who analyze these votes, but you cannot directly copy and paste your understanding of voting when you analyze like men and women officials at the national level who vote on a certain topic, when it's representative of member states who vote. And so the policy preferences of member states representatives are so different than the policy preferences of one person in a national parliament. So this kind of application you have for voting analysis, you have to think of an adjustment. And I'm not an expert on voting, but in the chapter they explain that even at the fundamental way of thinking of voting in IOs, you have to change your assumptions, but also quantitatively there are tools and tricks that you have to be aware of when you do voting. So this is an example. I could also speak of using statistics from IOs. It's really not the same as using statistics from one country, because IOs have to standardize their data. So you have to understand where do these data come from in order to apply them. So these are small things that it's good to be aware of them when you want to apply a certain method or to use certain kind of data. So that would be kind of two examples. I don't know if you want to complement. So, but basically the thesis of the book is that there is, in some instances, you have to adapt. In some instances, you do not. But we do not say that there are specific research methods for IOs, but you have to be aware of the adjustments that you need to do. That would be the answer.
I have a finger on that, of course, because I think that, and this is my interpretation, I haven't read the book, but I really want to do so. I think that there is a lack in general of an understanding of methods to study sites that are not bounded, that can be, defined explicitly. Like, sure, we have about multi-sited ethnography and participant observations, but there are some sites like a summit, a conference, an event that is there for 3 hours and then dismantles, and then you follow it through social media, through interviews, through reading the documents that come up. So I think that this book, in the inception that you're at, speaks to like an even broader need in international studies as a general, to understand like these sites that are not bounded, that cannot be easily retrieved. Sure, you can go to a site and do an ethnography, but then when you're following a community of practice, when you're following a development, when you're following the aftermath of an event or the previous things, it becomes a lot more complicated how to do it with while attempting systematicity, in a way that can be rendered transparent. So that's why I think like this book can be a good way in launching some conversations about that lack of a grammar in a way, or a blueprint that we have. Like, sure, we have to be creative, but it's also good to have, as you say, companionship and an understanding and broader reflections.
Thank you very much for your comment and dissemination. First of all, we'd like to remind ourselves that we were the Swiss National Science Foundation has granted us open access. So for us, it was very important to make this knowledge available. So as long as we can, as long as we have internet, it's possible to download it. So that's the first big element that we were very adamant about having, and which in our view is a success. Now, of course, it has to go beyond. So events like that are extraordinary for us because it allows us to have an immediate exchange with our peers, and then we will have it, of course, through our students, and we're also counting on the amount of contributors from around the world who can then also relay the information and be able to disseminate the work. And I think we shouldn't neglect the importance of Twitter. We have Twitter Queen here, who has managed to make a tweet about every chapter, everything, and it has been seen, 15 million times? No, maybe not. How many clicks or how many things? 15,000, something like that. So I think there has, no, it's true. So I think this is also something that is in modern day a tool that we we need to develop and be aware of, which I am still lagging behind with. But I think that those are the main strategies so far. And if you have any other more insight, we're more than willing to hear them. Yes.
I come from the public health discipline. There are lots of newsletters which are in almost every domain, whether it's vaccination, maternal health, or this thing. So a lot of this type of information, new tools, new guides, new thing becoming available. It is posted as a, let's say, blurb or a short note. So the interested people can click and download it. So the interest is not so much the physical distribution or this thing, but getting the message out to as wide audience as possible. And your audience is not general public, it's the professional groups. So I'm sure in the discipline you are, there would be these newsletters or some of these platforms which can allow this thing to go out very widely.
Thanks a lot for the advice. I would just maybe conclude on the COVID-19 question. So on a very practical level, the idea first was that we would review, two of us would review the first version of each contribution, then the contributor would revise the contribution, and then someone within one of other contributors within the table of content will do another review. And what happened is that because everybody was so overburdened with the pandemic, we decided to do that ourselves. So we unload the burden from our contributors so that we would do more reviewing because we knew that it was such a difficult time for everyone. But because it was such a difficult time, it was also challenging for us. We decided not to put pressure on ourselves around the timing. So yeah, it took 5 years, but it's out there, and we still, I think the kindness that we apply to the contributors, we also try to apply it among ourselves. I think that was really part of the journey to make sure that we allow for just life to happen. And if it takes a few extra months, there's no academic emergencies. That does not exist. If the book is out a few months after, nobody's going to die. So I think it's important not to stay this myth and to be sure that the deadlines are just fake. Nothing's going to happen if we don't keep them. So that's probably one way to summarize how we cope with COVID-19 during writing this book.
But if I want to just add one thing, it was interesting because we did acknowledge COVID in the book because it forced us to rethink certain methods. And it's true, there's one box that was entitled Skype interviews, and then all of a sudden it became completely irrelevant because everybody was using online interviews, so we switched it to online interviews. It was right. It would have been Zoom now, but so the pandemic did impact not only on our organization but also on the way. On the titles, but also on the way we know that future questions might arise. How do you create research at a distance, like we were discussing with methodology in another instance. So of course we acknowledge it, and that would definitely be one of the areas to further investigate.
Perfect. Thank you. I think it's already 6.
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. So it's time to close the event. I would like to thank the speakers for their insights, also those in the audience for their active participation. And last but not least, to congratulate, of course, Lucile, Fanny, and Leah for this amazing achievement. I'm sure it will be widely read and of big help to many students out there writing their thesis, their PhDs, not only in IR, but also beyond in other disciplines. So thank you and congratulations. And for those here, you can join us for the reception outside. I hope you can join us. Thank you so much. Thank you.